Hi, this is JP Morgan. Today on the Slanted Lens, we're out here at Camera West. It's a great camera store out in the Palm Springs area in
Rancho Mirage.
And I've got with me here
Ben Carpenter.
Ben and I are going to talk about the new GFX 100. We've got it in our hands. I mean, we've only had it in our hands for like a minute.
5 minutes, maybe at the most.
5 minutes. But finally, we have it in our hands. So what's your first thought as you look at it? What's impressive to you? What do you think the future is for this camera?
Well, it feels like a GFX 50S with a hand grip. So that's familiar. And I'm really liking the ergonomics, of course, because the 50S was so good at that. But yeah, we've got some new things inside of the camera that are really going to be, I think, game changers for this sector of photography. So we've got the larger sensor, or the higher megapixel sensor.
Yeah, you got a 100 megapixel sensor there, which is incredible. I mean, this really is an ultimate landscape kind of setup, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think it's going to go beyond that as well, because we've got a full sensor phase detect autofocus system here, and we also have internal body stabilization, which is not anything we've seen in this medium format game yet.
Yeah, not in a medium format at all. That's incredible. We also get a 420 internal 10-bit recording, but a 422 10-bit out through the HDMI port, which is really fabulous if you're going to pick up a signal to be able to match. That's broadcast quality, and that's really what it should be. You can exchange the viewfinder as well, right?
Yeah, pops right off just like the 50S. You can put your EVF tilt adapter on here, which is something, I mean, I've just loved on the 50S camera, because when you're on a tripod, that EVF can turn into more of a right angle finder. I think it's a great feature. So I just pulled this out and noticed that there's two
dual
batteries in there.
That's nice.
Yeah, that's really cool to see. We've got internal body stabilization on this camera. So I'm sure that's going to take a lot more battery power.
You're going to need the power.
You've got these two big batteries here, and you should be good to go for a long time.
All right, well, let's get to some tests. I want to see an image quality test. I'd love to see an ISO test, just to see how it handles when you get on those faster ISOs and just where it starts to break down. And then let's just shoot around a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to it.
Sounds good.
We're going to do a quick image quality test here. We'll shoot some shots inside on the strobe setup, and then some shots outside here, and just take a look and see exactly what we got. I'm telling you, this camera just gives stunning images. The first images we shot in this picture quality test were with strobe. We had a ProPhoto strobe, and we're with an umbrella on a gray background. This is a 102 megapixel image, and it is absolutely amazing. Look at the detail in her eye, on each of these, in the iris. You see all of the detail that creates that eye. It's at the point where it's almost so sharp that in a lot of ways when you're doing people, you're going to want to soften it out just a little bit. This first image is at f2, with both these are f2. So this is on a 110 millimeter lens at f2. So if you look at her eye, her right eye, or camera left eye, it's sharp. When you look at her camera right eye, or her left eye, it's starting to drift. You don't see the same detail in the iris that you do. On medium format, the depth of field is so shallow. At f2, you really have just very little depth of field. I can't even, she's turned towards me and I'm not carrying both eyes. So you'd have to be at f4, even 5.6 to carry both of her eyes. You see how quickly it falls off on the side of her face. Her ear is way out of focus. But that eye, her right eye, camera left eye, is sharp as could be. It's beautiful. So I shot another one here. This is just a profile of her. Wanted to show that you get that eye in focus. This is beautiful color. It was very easy to correct. This is pretty much just right out of the camera. I didn't correct anything. I just adjusted the color balance slightly to give me what I felt like was a correct color for the setup that we're in. But these are gorgeous images. They are gorgeous images. So I took it outside, because outside the light's not quite so sharp, not quite so just kind of sharp as it is inside, because you don't have that highlight and shadow kind of specular lights that you get with a strobe light. So outside it's going to be a little different. And if you look at it here, I never really got one that I felt like her eye was as in focus as I wanted it to. The first one here is shot at f2 again, and this one is pretty shallow. I'm getting the front of her eye in focus, but not her eye. But the bokeh is beautiful. The way it falls off in the background is so beautiful and so soft. I did another one now. I shot at f4. On this, I'm getting a little better look at her eye now. It's starting to give me the detail at her camera left eye, or her right eye. I'm starting to get that detail. But look at the bokeh in the background. This is just, it falls beautifully out of focus. I mean, you don't have any problem getting things to fall out of focus with a medium format camera. Inside the camera, you have the ability to emulate any of the Fujifilm films if you want to use that as kind of those become their standards for where you want to select your color. But I just used a normal standard, didn't do anything to it. So this is just a straight raw image off from the camera, and I think they're absolutely beautiful. We're going to do our dynamic range test now. I'm going to find a normal exposure, and then I'm going to overexpose by 5 stops, then I'm going to underexpose by 5 stops, and just see if we can recover those in Photoshop and just see how great the dynamic range is on this camera. This camera had a pretty amazing range because when I go normal here, it was really easy to hold the highlights with just a normal exposure. When I went to -1, if you take a look at it here, I can't tell the difference between these two. I can't tell it. I recovered the highlights absolutely fine. The -1 was no problem. -2, I'm still recovering the highlights. I was able to recover the highlights at -3 without any problem, at -4 without any problems. At -5, I was able to recover the highlights without any problem on this with this camera. When I go to a +1, I'm able to hold the highlights on that sidewalk, but at +2, they're gone. I mean, they're just absolutely gone. So at +3, you see the color. If you go back to +1, that +1 compared to the normal, the color shifts just a little bit. It starts to shift just a little bit pink. But by the time you go to +2, it's gone very yellow, and the highlights are blown out on the ground, can't hold them whatsoever. +3, we're now starting to posterize. Her skin is gone kind of yellowish, and we're posterizing now. There's just no detail left in the highlights whatsoever. So at +4, it's just blown out. She's basically a ghost, and I mean, we didn't do a +5, but couldn't have handled it. So interesting, on that range of overexposing, as in all digital processes, it doesn't like to be overexposed, but this camera could have been underexposed by at least 2 more stops. I went underexposed by 5. I think I could have gone easily to 7 stops. Let's take a quick look at the color on these. Look at the spider checker. If I go from normal to -1 to -2 to -3 to -4 to -5, I'm not seeing any color shift in this spider checker at all. So incredible dynamic range, just held the highlights extremely well. This would actually not be a bad street camera if you're in really difficult lighting situations. You want to shoot in very contrasty situations. This camera would work extremely well in that because it just has the ability to hold those highlights. Let's take a look at the ISO test now. I set this up, and the first exposure was at 1 second. And what that means is it was really hard for her to hold still. She really had a hard time holding still. So I'm going to look at the grain transition in the shadow over her left shoulder, and there's a shadow of her jacket on the wall there. So at 100 ISO, it's exactly what you think and would expect. You see the transition from the highlight to the shadow, and it's very, very clean. 200 ISO, there's a little bit of grain. You see it as it builds in that transition between the highlight and the shadow. 400, I'm already starting to see a little bit of grain. At this point, I think she's holding still enough we can look at her face there. And let's just take a look at the transition in her nose. I'm already starting to see a little bit of grain build. At 800 ISO, you see the grain starting to build. It's not terrible. For video, would be no problem whatsoever. If I want a really clean, beautiful still image, I wouldn't shoot at 800 ISO. At 1600, you're really starting to see the grain pattern in her eye as it builds towards her nose. We have 3200. That grain is even building more. It's becoming very pronounced at 3200. You see it through the whites of her eyes and in the just in the shadow transitions. Very, very strong. We've got major grain at 64. I think for a still image, this thing was unusable, I believe. I think 400. I'd try to stay at 100 or 200, maybe 400. I mean, you accept the grain as part of the process. It's like shooting triax back in the film days and pushing at 2 stops. You know it's going to be grainy. So if you're in a dark situation and that's the only option you have, then of course you're going to do it. You know, and that's just, you accept that that's part of the process. But when you go to 12,800, it's like, holy cow. It's now at this point, we're just pixelized. 256,000. Again, the grain is extremely strong. It's starting to just break up. There's hardly any transition between the shadows and the highlights any longer. Boy, at the last one at 512,000 ISO, it's so grainy. But if you look at the color checker, I'm going to run back through. I'm really pleased with how the color stayed pretty consistent, didn't shift through that whole process. The grain build was very strong. So I think the ISO on this camera is very happy for stills on the lower end and can get up into 1600, maybe 3200 for video. But there's a good look at the ISO. Now for the autofocus in still mode. I was not as impressed with this one as I hoped I would be. I expected it to just be incredible, but it had a little bit of a hard time. It struggled. There's only 9 frames here. The eye detect and the face detect, they did okay. I mean, the first 2 frames, it holds on and it's acceptable. 3rd frame holds on and it's a little softish. It really is a little softish. 4th frame, it's back in, it's pretty sharp. Definitely out on the 5th frame. 6th frame is totally out. 7th frame is sharp as could be. 8th frame, sharp as could be. 9th frame, even though she closed her eyes, sharp as could be. So in video mode, I really want to take a look at the autofocus with this camera and just see how it will hold a person as they walk towards us. I mean, this is becoming such a standard for cameras nowadays. So as I click on this, it's a beautiful image. As she walks towards me, it's holding her focus. I mean, she's not moving super fast, but she walks right up to me and it's going to hold the focus right to where she gets right up into the camera. And this is handheld. As she walks towards us, not on a tripod, I'm hand holding it. So here's my second attempt, and again, as she walks towards me, she stays in focus. It's just very comfortable, right into a tight face shot. Camera doesn't have any problem holding onto her. Sometimes it moves a little bit, but I would expect some of that. I can't say this beats the best cameras that are out there right now, but I feel like it's in the same category with regards to this autofocus. So autofocus in still mode, not as impressive as I had hoped it would be, but the autofocus in the video mode, I feel like is as good as anything on the market right now, and just gave me a great image as people walk towards the camera and focus the whole way, works seamlessly. So the GFX 100 includes sensor shift image stabilization, and it compensates for up to 5.5 stops of camera shake. I really wanted to see what that looked like, especially when you're on that large sensor. As we're moving through this, it really did compensate. The frame is floating. You can see my steps in it. I thought it was very impressive, as I've seen. This camera really is going to be incredible if you want to put it on a drone. You'll be able to use it in a drone situation. You're going to be able to use it to do some handheld work. I think it becomes just, makes it more and more a video camera rather than just like a landscape still camera. And I think that's pretty important to see that kind of progression with this series of cameras. Lens-wise, I absolutely love that 110mm f2 lens. F2 lens on a medium format, though, is kind of crazy because the reality is just about nothing's in focus, especially if you're doing a head and shoulders. F2 is just way too shallow. So you're going to want, I'm going to be at f4 most of the time, but that 110mm lens was beautiful. Gave me a beautiful image and a sharp image, and I thought it was a great addition. There's the 32-64 f4 lens, which is a great walk-around lens. It's not going to be quite up to a 50mm lens. It's going to be a little wider, which is going to be nice, but as just a walk-around lens, a great lens on that camera. So there are lenses for this camera. There's great applications, so get out there and check it out. Make sure you follow us on YouTube so you can see our lessons that come out each week. But just as important is to be able to follow us on Instagram, where you can see what we're up to every single day. We're always on. We're always on. So get over to Instagram, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, or like us on Facebook. Like us, follow us, smile us, thumbs up, all those kinds of things, and keep those cameras rolling. Keep on clicking.